Okay. So this session is being recorded. So for future reference, I would like to say this is day 2, December the 9th, of the virtual conference entitled Adaptation, Appropriation, Translation, organized by the Theatre and Drama Network. So greetings and salutations, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for a talk delivered by journalist, lecturer, and theatre critic Aleks Sierz, who is also a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts. I would like to also welcome Aleks Sierz on behalf of Theatre and Drama Network and thank him for accepting their invitation. Of course, you're all familiar with his work, especially in your face theatre, British Drama Today, here are copies, published in 2001 and translated as Suratına Tiyatrosu, Britanya'da In Your Face Tiyatrosu, here. His book defined a new generation of British playwrights such as Anthony Neilson, Sarah Kane, Mark Ravenhill, and their work, together with other playwrights, including Martin Crimp, whose adaptations will be the subject of Sierz' talk today. Aleks, you can see it in the photos. His subsequent work include those on prominent playwrights, such as his book, The Theatre of Martin Crimp, published in 2006, and Giles Osborne's Look Back in Anger, published in 2008, as well as more extensive studies of contemporary theatre in Britain, such as Rewriting the Nation, British Theatre Today, published in 2011, Modern British Playwriting, the 1990s, published a year later, and with Leah Gilardi, The Time Traveller's Guide to British Theatre, the First 400 Years, published in 2015, and translated our very own Mesut Günenç and Samet Zıngıl. Would you please show them? You can, Mesut Günenç is showing us a copy of the translation, so many thanks for that. Aleks Sierz' most recent book is entitled Good Night Out, A History of Popular British Theatre Since the Second World War, published in 2021, focusing on popular drama in Britain. The book has been organized, actually thematically devoted respectfully to, chapters such as, war, crime, sex, family, class, history, and fantasy. And in fact, it's a very good source book because it includes in the appendix over 1,000, list of 1,000 performances in British theatre between the years 1945 and 2015. Now, today, Aleks Sierz will be focusing on 2 recent adaptations by Martin Crimp, When We Have Sufficiently Tortured Each Other, which is subtitled 12 Variations on Samuel Richardson's Pamela, which gives us an idea on, its adaptation. And you can see it. Aleks Sierz is showing us the book. And the second play is Cyrano de Bergerac, probably adaptation of maybe Edmond Rostand. So ladies and gentlemen, students, scholars, and spectators, I'm delighted to present to you Aleks Sierz. The title of his talk is Free or Variable, Martin Crimp and the Art of Adaptation.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. And thank you all for the invitation to come and talk at this conference. Obviously, it's an honor to be invited here, and I'd just like to thank the organizing committee of the conference, as well as all the other participants who have made their interventions and questions, and of course, the fascinating keynote speeches. I don't usually say this, but actually I've learned a lot from all the others. So that's been really great for me. So thank you, everybody. And yeah, publicly, I'd like to thank Mesut for his reaching out to me, and obviously for his translation of the book by me and Leah Gilardi. Yeah, I hope it, Mesut, I hope it does well. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alex.
It's really shameless what we're doing, but all right, let's carry on. Okay, I'm conscious that this is a Zoom event and that most speakers have been sharing their screens using PowerPoint presentations with illustrative production pictures, beautiful graphics, and even videos. I have to say that I find using PowerPoint on Zoom to be rather awkward. I prefer to see everybody all together in front of me, all the faces. I find that much more reassuring, much more human. So I'll be doing something slightly different. I've decided not to use a visible PowerPoint. Instead, I would like to illustrate my talk with an invisible PowerPoint presentation, okay? So I'll be relying on you after my prompts to imagine the pictures that I would normally be putting on a presentation if I was at a live event, okay? So after all, this is a conference about adaptations. This is a conference about theatre and the arts and the imagination. So I think it's really good to ask you to picture in your mind's eye the things that I'll be talking about, so that you will continue to be an active audience, which I think is great. So I hope you will, to use, I couldn't resist this, adapt to this new situation, okay? Okay, if you're ready, let me paint my first picture. The first thing I'd like you to imagine is a tall pile of play texts, okay? It's a bit like if you look over my shoulder, there's a lot of play text there under that picture. I think it's Sarah Kane, okay? Yeah, so I'd like you to imagine that there are several piles of these thin play texts, but they're not like a bookshop or regular. But they're a bit kind of rough, you know, a sort of rough pile. One of the piles has fallen over. So it's more like a study, a table in a study with these play texts. And of course, because of the subject of this conference, all of the play texts are adaptations for theatre, either of novels or of other theatre plays, okay? So this is the background image, and it's my first imaginary PowerPoint slide. Before I look at two adaptations of the work of playwright Martin Crimp, I'd like to make a couple of general statements about the subject of adaptation. I'm sorry if these repeat a bit some of the points already made, but that's the problem of being the third or fourth keynote speaker. You know, all the best bits have happened already, so I hope you bear with me. You all look very generous, so that's pretty cool for me. So yeah, so on the background of this pile of play text, there's three bullet points in words appear. And the first bullet point says, adaptations are very common and very popular. The second bullet point says, adaptations work worst when the storytelling is too literal. And the third bullet point, excuse me, is adaptations work best when they are most radical. And I want to sort of bear in mind those three propositions. So I'll briefly talk through them now, and then see how the work of Martin Crimp can sort of talk to these ideas. So point one, adaptations are very common and very popular. I know it's a truism, but I think it's interesting that, like history plays, there have been dozens of adaptations on British stages in the last 10, even 20 years, and before then also. I don't know, there's something I can think of probably every year. There's at least 30 to 50 adaptations of new plays in British theatre. So over 10 years, that would make 500 new plays. there's probably exactly the same, if not slightly less, perhaps, of actual history plays as well. So these are huge numbers. And of course, the problem then, it's very difficult to make generalizations that apply to every single one. But anyway, let's try it like this. If you think of the most popular theatre shows, the ones that run for years and years and years, especially in London, especially in the West End, if you think of musicals like The Phantom of the Opera, or Matilda the musical, if you think of hit shows like The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime, or War Horse, Les Miserables, of course, even The Mousetrap, which is an adaptation by the author herself of a previous short story. The idea of adaptations being everywhere, I mean, you end up thinking, is there a popular show that hasn't been an adaptation? You know, that becomes a sort of question all of its own. So why are these so popular? I think we heard in the first keynote about history plays. One of the reasons is that these are subjects that have instant audience recognition value, okay? People recognize the titles of adaptations. They know what to expect. They know why they're going to the theatre. There's also a little bit of a game. If they love the original, they might want to see it in a different medium. They might even, and this I think happens with Jane Austen fans, they might even want to complain about the adaptation. You know, there's a kind of game. I think the phrase in English is, it's not in the book. Yeah, okay. So if somebody kisses somebody passionately on screen in a Jane Austen film, it's not in the book, you know? So that kind of feeling. I think the familiarity of the subject, both in an adaptation and in a history play, is something that actually draws people. We could discuss things about national stereotypes, the fact that in British culture, the idea of history is very strong, it's very attractive. Lots of people are interested in it, both in real history or academic history, if you like, and in historical fiction. So this is a kind of background to my keynote today. Point 2 of the bullet points is perhaps a bit more contentious. I'm not exactly sure if it's true, but I'm going to give it a go anyway. Adaptations work worst when the storytelling is too literal. And by this, I mean that the stage version that follows its, let's call it, source too closely, especially if this source has a simple linear plot, occasionally works worse than if you take a more imaginative view. This is particularly true, I think, of novels. Novels are very literary. They're often fragmented in their storytelling. They have many pages of descriptive writing, sometimes of very poetic writing. It's hard to you know, I know what the problem is. It's very hard to reproduce 300 pages of literature on a stage for a maximum of 3 hours, which I think is just about when things begin to get unbearable in the theatre. I can see the problem of transposing a novel onto the stage, but recently I had the pleasure, or obviously not, of seeing Maggie O'Farrell's wonderful novel called Hamnet, which links to the Shakespeare theme of many of the strands of this conference. It's basically the story of Mrs. Shakespeare, Agnes, in this particular version. The book is, as I said, non-linear in its storytelling. It goes backwards and forwards, and it's very evocative of a whole world. Unfortunately, the stage version by Lalita Chakrabarti, which is produced by the Royal Shakespeare Company and directed by Erica Wyman, has been rather disappointing in my view, because it just tells the story from the beginning to the end in a literal line, okay? And there's something that is very pedestrian, very predictable, and very kind of, to me anyway, uninteresting about that way of adapting a theatre play, a novel to a theatre play. Okay, I'll move on to point 3. Adaptations work best when they are most radical. Once again, I'm not even sure if this is true, but I'm throwing it out there as a kind of provocation. Now, this is a big subject, so I'll try and be succinct. I always laugh when I know that there's an hour set aside for this, but okay. So basically, radical adaptations. I'll give 2 examples from the world of film. There are many film adaptations, as I've indicated, of Jane Austen's novels. Let's take Emma. Perhaps, in my view, the best adaptation of this is Amy Hetterlink's Clueless from 1995. It is set in a contemporary or 1990s California. The language is quite poetic, but it's not Jane Austen's poetry, okay? You know, there's references to menstruation and all the kind of things that are actually excluded in a lot of 19th century novels, but obviously a part of female experience. So it's kind of quite radical. It follows the storyline more or less the same, but it completely transposes it. And in doing so, it generates a lot of different meanings. Another example would be Francis Ford Coppola's Apocalypse Now, which is, of course, Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, but it's transposed to a different country, a different era, and it is, in fact, completely different. But something about that seems to sort of chime with the kind of pleasure that you get if you are, as an audience member, if you know the original and you know the adaptation. So those are my sort of 3 points, and I'll move on now to looking at the work of Martin Crimp, okay? So I'd like to test these propositions by looking at 2 case studies, 2 plays from the same year, 2019. That sounds kind of very neat, and I was very pleased when that happened, by the playwright Martin Crimp, okay? So I haven't forgotten. My next invisible PowerPoint slide is a photograph. It's a real-life photograph. It's kind of, I have to be careful here because I'm an old man. It's an old man, okay? Not me, I hasten to add. It's an old man with white hair, cut into a kind of a bob. You know what I mean? With a bob, yeah? White hair, the bob. A kind of distinguished looking face, characterized, deep lines, yeah? And he's shown more or less in profile. I want you to imagine this. And 3/4, so you can see his shoulders and most of his body. He's wearing a crimson long-sleeved t-shirt, and he's sitting in front of an open window with his hands clasped together and resting on a wooden desk. Okay, I hope you can all see that. I should ask you to close your eyes, but it's too much. Okay, so you can see him sitting there anyway. He has a yellow notebook and a pen in front of him. Of course, he's a writer. You know, that's the kind of symbolism for the writer, isn't it? And behind him is a wall of bare bricks and some thin pipes. If any of you have been to the Royal Court Theatre in London, you'll recognize that as the location of this photograph. So this is Martin Crimp, of course, okay? I'm not going to assume that you all know very much about his work, so I'm going to give some bullet points, an account of a brief resume, if you like, of his working life, okay? So this is Martin Crimp. He was born in 1956, and he goes to Pocklington Grammar School outside York in the north of England. And that school's relevant because it also educated playwright Tom Stoppard, obviously several decades before Martin Crimp. But Tom Stoppard, his 1966 drama, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, is obviously a really good example of taking, well, it's a classic example of taking minor characters in a story and foregrounding them while the same story develops in the background. Okay, so Crimp now studies English at Cambridge University, and after writing his thesis on James Joyce's Ulysses, he graduates in 1979. He tries to write a novel himself unsuccessfully, and in 1981 he joins the writers group of the tiny Orange Tree Theatre in Richmond, South London, where he now lives. And this fringe venue stages the first 6 of his plays, which are mainly influenced by absurdist playwrights such as Samuel Beckett and Eugene Ionesco. By 1987, I find this kind of interesting because he's writing in one style. Somebody kindly suggests to him that he should read the plays of American playwright David Mamet. I don't know if you're familiar with his work. Some of you look as if you are, but Martin Crimp is energized by this because reading the dialogue of a typical Mamet play, it has a certain pace, a certain rhythm, which he immediately picks up on. And he's energized by this kind of dialogues that Mamet is good at. And he writes his own play called Dealing with Claire, which is what you would call a breakthrough play. It stars a very famous, in those days, film star, Tom Courtenay, even though it's produced by a small fringe theatre. And it is Martin Crimp's entry card into the bigger world of new writing in British theatre. So by the 1990s, he becomes a Royal Court playwright. And this venue produces his classic plays. I'll only name 2 of them, otherwise we'll be here all afternoon. The 2 that I would urge you to find out about, if you don't know them already, are The Treatment in 1993 and Attempts on Her Life in 1997. Attempts on Her Life, a wonderful play that is completely challenging and brilliant to teach to students because it gives them an enormous amount of room for discussion about theatre form as well as about theatre content. I have to say, though, that I have interviewed Martin Crimp quite often, obviously for the book that I wrote about him. And in that one, he told me that in 1996, he suffered from a kind of writer's block. I don't think it was necessarily about not being able to write plays. It's just he didn't want to keep repeating the same kind of play. He's very sort of modernistic in this kind of almost austere challenges that he does to himself. So what he decided to do was, he wanted to write, so what he decided to do was adaptation. Martin Crimp is fluent in French, and he decided then to adapt Molière's The Misanthrope, which, as you probably all know, was first staged in 1666. And he did a modern English language version. It's a radical adaptation in the sense that it's set in contemporary society in our world and not in the world of the 17th century. And from then on, Crimp his career has developed along 2 parallel lines, okay? One line is original new plays, things that he's thought up, his own sort of plot lines and so on and so forth. And the other line is adaptations, sometimes of Chekhov, sometimes of French classics. And as we'll see, that applies to what we're going to be discussing in a minute. So ever since the mid-1990s, then, Crimp has produced many examples of these kinds of work, as well as 4 texts for opera with the composer George Benjamin. So for the rest of this keynote, I'm going to look at 2 examples of these adaptations. Once again, I ask you, I'd like you to imagine in your mind's eye my next invisible PowerPoint slide, please. which is a production photograph of a theatre play. The stage is dark and bleak and bare. The color palette is gray and rather somber. At the front stands a man who is gripping a microphone stand and obviously rapping into a mic. He is wearing a black t-shirt and trendy dark trousers. Behind him, the other cast members also casually dressed. The caption of this picture identifies the actor James McAvoy as the rapper and the play as Martin Crimp's Cyrano de Bergerac. Okay? All these images are available online, so actually you could be looking at those. As I'm sure most of you know, Cyrano de Bergerac tells the story of Cyrano, who else? A poet, a soldier, a duelist, okay, who falls in love with his cousin Roxanne, but is too shy to approach her because he has an enormous nose, okay, it's a really large nose, and he feels that it makes him look ugly, okay? But when she tells him that she's falling in love with Christian, who's a new recruit in Cyrano's military, whatever it was, a fascinating kind of love triangle develops, okay? And the reason for this is, of course, that Cyrano is very handsome, but tongue-tied. He's not very good with words. So the poet Cyrano writes Christian's love letters to Roxanne and helps him out. And you probably all remember the play's most famous scene, the balcony scene. Christian talks to Roxanne while Cyrano prompts him, gives him all the words he needs. And Roxanne, of course, is overwhelmed by this torrent of beautiful language, okay? It's not necessarily realistic. The play text states, as I think I've showed you before, that this version is freely adapted from the original play by Edmond Rostand, which was first performed in Paris in 1897. Rostand's play itself is a pastiche, maybe a stylistic appropriation, if you want, of French 17th century verse drama using a real historical character, Cyrano, who was a 17th century writer, etc., etc. Although the original play, Rostand's play, is written in rhyming couplets of 12 syllables on every line, similar to the classical Alexandrine rhyme scheme of neoclassical French drama, Crimp's adaptation changes this rather strict and, in the English language, rather constricting form into much freer verse. So he avoids the tedium of that kind of repetitive rhythm, but he uses, but still uses rhyme, for example, for, how do you say, humorous purposes. As it says on the play text, it's a free adaptation. As I said before, in preparing this keynote, I have spoken to Martin Crimp again about this play, and he told me that he likes to have constraints. He likes to set himself constraints when he's writing his work. So he set himself the rule that the play should sound just like people talking, okay? So it's going to be in verse, but it's going to be free verse. It's going to be a sort of classical story, but the people must sound as if they're really talking in the here and now. So he says, and here I'm quoting, "I tried to prioritize the sense and dramatic action of the play over any cleverness on my part." That's him. And he thinks that a kind of regular rhyme scheme in English tends to make your work sound like something by Alexander Pope. Okay. That's, you know, not necessarily on stage, that's probably a killer. Okay, so he wanted to concentrate on the emotional transactions of the play. And when he saw it in front of an audience in a production directed by Jamie Lloyd and featuring, as I've said before, James McAvoy, he was delighted to see that this worked, okay? The audience was really sympathetic to Cyrano, but they were also sympathetic to Roxanne, etc., and the other characters. So he puts it like this: everything in my version departs from the original, but stays close to the original, which I think is kind of a nice and interesting formulation to get your head around, okay? This production also made other adaptations, if you like, to our world, okay? And the most obvious change to the story, and this is a production adaptation, which of course Martin Crimp, as well as Jamie Lloyd, the director, and James McAvoy all agreed with, was to actually dispense with the big nose, okay? So the one thing that everybody knows about Cyrano, the big nose, doesn't exist in this production. And this, of course, gives an entirely different meaning to his shyness and to the way he behaves. Actually, he has, can we say it, self-esteem issues. Yeah, he thinks he's ugly, but he's not really. And if you, I don't know if you know James McAvoy, especially on stage, he is so charismatic. You couldn't say he was ugly, you know. I mean, you know. So that's the first thing that they changed that made this adaptation quite radical. The second thing is that they dispensed entirely with any props, apart from microphone stands. I think they had 3 chairs, and that was about it. Yeah. So the entire production, the famous balcony scene, there is no balcony, there is no house. It's all in our imaginations in the audience, okay? And the other thing that I suppose that he was thinking of, I'm talking of Martin Crimp now, in creating this play was how exactly do you translate from the original this idea that poetry is vital in somebody's life? Yeah, if you look at Rostand's Cyrano de Bergerac, as indeed with neoclassical French drama, poetry is like really important. People will fight you for poetry. People live and die for it. It's really important. Do we have a modern equivalent? And Martin Crimp was worried about that until somebody said, yeah, have you never been to a slam, you know, open slam poetry, open mic event, whatever? And he hadn't, and he went, and he found that in rap and sort of those kinds of performance poetry, there was the modern equivalent of the importance that this has in terms of language, playing with language, using rhymes, making jokes, creating a whole atmosphere just verbally, and he transposed this to the play. So yeah, his adaptation, therefore, has been written in an invented language, which is contemporary, but also artificial in its own way. And what he likes about this is, and what I like about it, is that it creates a unity because most of the characters are speaking this same, you know, rather exalted language, and it lets everything gel together. He also told me that he had preferred that the main, and I like this phrase as well, the main cultural surgery, I love that, cultural surgery that he performed on the play has to do with Roxanne, the main, obviously, female character, and especially her acceptance or non-acceptance of her situation. You won't be surprised that in the original French play, she's a Victorian woman, okay? She is quite submissive to men, and especially at the end, there's a moment where Cyrano says to her, I wrote all those beautiful love letters for Christian, okay? In the original French, she says something, I don't know the exact words, but she says something like, "Oh, that's wonderful. I love you too." Yeah, okay. Actually, Martin Crimp thought that this was in a kind of, yeah, now rather retrograde view of sort of a woman's reaction to hearing that she's been deceived for several years, and in this important aspect of her life. So he has Roxanne at the end being very angry with this whole thing, okay? He also makes some more sort of emotionally true aspects of her character to come out. And if you like, the main meaning of his adaptation, which follows actually quite literally the storytelling shape of the original source, his main radicalism is in the play's gender politics, okay? And I think that is exactly right, okay? And oh dear, I'm running out of time really, but okay. But I'll still talk a little bit about the ending of this play before moving on to the next one. As you've heard, this play is a love triangle. And Crimp added one line for Roxanne. He invented this line at the very end when she discovers that Cyrano's been writing the love letters, but she was in love with Christian, who looked so beautiful. She says, "Have I loved two men? Question mark. Or no men at all? Question mark." So have I loved two men or no men at all? So the gender politics is that one woman, Roxanne, who's intelligent as well as beautiful, equals, well, you need two men to equal her, okay? And I think that's kind of provocative in our current society. The other thing is, of course, that Martin Crimp adds a homoerotic moment. It's just a moment, but at one point, Cyrano and Christian kiss each other. And I have to say, in a theater, when I saw it, suddenly there's a shock there, okay? That kind of, if you like, momentary queering of the story, asking if Cyrano's shyness could be something else, or could Christian's inability to speak to women be something else? I don't know the answer. The playwright doesn't give the answer. The production doesn't give the answer, but it's there in the air, and it's a great theatrical moment. Okay, I'm conscious that time is passing, and I really want to speak a little bit about the other play as well. So I'm now going to ask you, and this is for the last time, I promise, to imagine another slide of my invisible PowerPoint presentation, okay? It shows a scene from Crimp's play When We Have Sufficiently Tortured Each Other, okay? Staged at the National Theatre in 2019, directed by Katie Mitchell. I'm going to call this the Pamela play because the title is a mouthful. It's really difficult to say, when we have sufficiently tortured one another or each other. You see, I've already got it wrong. Anyway, the picture depicts a darkened room, which turns out to be a large garage, you know, a garage attached to your house. And it's occupied by a car, big car. And the picture shows a maid, somebody dressed as a maid, and an older man sitting on chairs to the left. And on the right, in the background, are two young women dressed as schoolgirls. In the shadows, another young woman. You might recognize the maid on the left as Cate Blanchett, the international film star. So that's easy, another star, okay? Crimp describes this play as 12 variations on Samuel Richardson's Pamela. So this refers, as you probably all know, to the epistolary novel Pamela, or Virtue Rewarded. I love those subtitles in novels from past centuries. That's wonderful. First published in 1740 by Samuel Richardson, okay? Who was a printer as well as a rather moralistic writer, I have to say. Although the title of Crimp's play is taken from a phrase that's actually used in the book, which is kind of amazing. His subtitle of 12 Variations suggests a radical reinterpretation of the work. And that's also true. So as a quick summary, I think you need to be reminded of the plot of Pamela, which is quite simple. Pamela Andrews is her name. She's 15 years old. I think that's kind of worth thinking about in today's world. She's a 15-year-old maid, you know, a housemaid, a servant. And she has to fight off the unwanted advances of her employer, Mr. B, a rich landowner. Okay, so his libertine behavior towards her involves actually kidnapping her, you know, grabbing her, taking her, and culminates in an attempted sexual assault. Mr. B employs Mrs. Jukes as the teenager's jailer. But in the end, as the subtitle suggests, Pamela successfully fights off his advances, and she is rewarded. I mean, this is the old world we're talking about. She is rewarded by being married to him, okay? Despite all this abusive treatment. I mean, okay, it is written by a guy, so, you know, and an 18th century guy at that, okay? In the process, though, she does discover her own love of writing and, if you like, her own voice as a kind of class rebel, if you want. And I'd commend this novel to you. It is a surprisingly exciting book, partly because Samuel Richardson loves exclamation marks. Yeah, so everything is a kind of exclamation. Yeah, and it's Pamela's letters and diaries. So she's very much this young person who's writing these exclamations. This is not a simple adaptation which follows the novel in terms of its storytelling. It is not a regular 3-act drama with a classical plot, but rather a series of 12 meditations on gender, desire, and sexual identity. It's got modern dress, contemporary language, and it doesn't even have anyone called Mr. B or Pamela in it. It has a man and a woman who are continually sparring, if you like. They're playing a game of gender identity. They're constantly imitating each other in the sense that the woman speaks as the man speaks as the woman. They change clothes. So there's a lot of fluidity there, if you like. Okay. If the play is completely dissimilar to the novel by Richardson, how is it an adaptation? I mean, why am I talking about this play in a conference about adaptation? Okay. Is it an appropriation? Or is it just a new play? Okay. The answer, I think, is suggested by Crimp's method. Okay. When he read the original novel, he noted 2 incidents which have a particular resonance today. And they are, I think, unconscious. I'm pretty sure they're unconscious, but they are very weird, okay? So in the novel, there's one moment when Mr. B attempts to rape Pamela, okay? So he hides himself in her bedroom in a kind of, you know, closet, okay? And he suddenly emerges in the middle of the night. But the thing is, he's wearing a woman's gown and a dressing gown, but a female one, okay? So he jumps out and he attempts to assault Pamela. Pamela screams and he's unable to assault her. And he just looks stupid because he's wearing these female clothes. I mean, yeah. So that's a kind of, I'd say, a queer moment, unconscious perhaps on Richardson's part, or maybe conscious, I don't know. The following morning, what happens is that Mr. B is very angry with Pamela, saying, "You frightened me by shouting and screaming." Okay, so this is a guy who's he's failed in his attempt to assault this woman. He's failed in his all right, performance of his identity as a libertine, as a rapist, as a ravisher. And yet he's angry at his victim. But his victim has not performed her role, okay? She has successfully fought him off. So that's a moment that Martin Crimp was thinking of that was very interesting to expand into a play about gender identity with that kind of queer sort of questioning of binary opposites. Who is male, who is female, who is straight, who is gay. And there's another also beautifully, I think, weird moment in the novel, and that's when Pamela attempts to escape, okay? So she attempts to escape, she finds a key, she leaves the house, and there's a field outside. This is a house where she's been held, you know, abducted and held as a prisoner. And there's a field, and she sees two bulls, okay? And she's frightened, of course. You know, I'm frightened of wild animals, well, even domestic animals if they're bulls. So, you know, she sees these two bulls and she identifies one of them as Mr. B, okay? And she identifies the other one as Mrs. Jukes, okay? So there are two male animals. She, in her mind, and through Richardson's mind, there's no problem identifying them with different genders, okay? So that's weird. The next thing that's even weirder is that she retreats and goes back and decides not to escape. And then she realizes that the two bulls were actually two cows, okay? Female animals, okay? So she's, you know, changed their sex, gender, whatever it is with animals. I don't even know the right word. So that's also a moment of extremely queering. And I think, once again, I think it's kind of unconscious if you think this is 150 years before psychoanalysis and so on and so forth, okay? So I think it's that which Martin Crimp took from the novel and expanded into his new play. So I think that actually that should be enough for this particular keynote. I've got several other pages, but I'm conscious that I've already spoken for 45 minutes, and I think that's enough. If anyone has any questions, please do go ahead.
So thank you for your entertaining talk with invisible PowerPoints, questioning whether an adaptation should be literal or liberal.
Yeah.
So now we shall proceed with the question and answer part of the session. You may also write your questions in the text box. You can see it below, sohbet. You can write the questions there, or you can ask them yourself.
Okay.
So, yes. Anyone? If not, I will. Okay,
sorry.
there.
This is perhaps a stupid question, and I could have Googled it, but my question is, in what accent does James McAvoy use in the production?
Yeah, very good. That's a really good question. Yeah, he speaks with a mild Scottish accent.
Okay.
Okay. So there's no attempt to Frenchify the story. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. So I think that's his natural voice. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank
I have
you.
to say he's not only a marvelously charismatic actor on stage, he's also a really generous member of a theatre company. Martin Crimp's told me that, you know, every time that there was a rehearsal or everything, he always wanted to make sure that everybody else in the company felt good about the material they were working with and stuff like that. And also when I've seen him on the television publicizing the play, he always says, this is a play that's been adapted by Martin Crimp. And, you know, I don't know what it's like in other countries, but in Britain, it's quite rare for an actor to actually acknowledge who's written the play. Yeah, they sometimes acknowledge the director, but, you know, the writer, and I think the writer needs a voice. Okay.
Thank you. And I have to say that these invisible PowerPoints definitely. So thank you for that.
We should use that in class.
Okay.
Okay. So that Dilek Hocam has a question. Yes, I
Yes.
saw a hand there.
Thank you very much, Aleks Sierz, for this wonderful speech. I really benefited from that. And in the first play you mentioned, adapted by Martin Crimp, he added this line, "Have I loved two men or none at all?"
Yeah.
So when you were talking about that, I was reminded of Martin Crimp's The Country, where one of the characters, Maurice, told Corinne that you two will be simulating love very well, like this simulation. And I was just wondering about your thoughts. Do you think in that sense, Martin Crimp is not revising, but revisiting his main, you know, interests in men and women's relationships, how they are simulating love? And can we see adaptation in relation with an act of or a practice of simulation as well?
Oh, that's
Maybe.
that last is such a big subject. I think
Really?
the whole conference is answering that,
Okay,
or
thank you
grappling
very
with,
much.
you know. But certainly, I think Martin Crimp definitely returns to the same subject time and time again. And I think that's normal for writers. I think the distinctive thing about Martin Crimp's work is that he doesn't have characters who are nice people. Okay, I mean, Cyrano perhaps, but in general, especially in the new plays that he writes, they are all people that you really instinctively dislike, I think. And so this idea of simulating love, you immediately think, oh gosh, I don't like this at all. You know, how would you do that? You know, the other thing is that he is a male writer, clearly, and he is a feminist writer in the sense that from the beginning he's been concerned about giving women their own voices and representing them on a par with the men in the plays. Is it the fact that he's not only married but has 3 daughters and therefore has lived in a very female household for several years, well, for decades? Is that part of it? And it's also one of these subjects that's rather difficult because, you know, there are a lot of men who are like, yeah, I'm a pro-feminist. Yeah, I'm a feminist. Yeah. But is there something a bit odd about that? You know, why should men try and, I don't know, I'm going to say trespass on feminist territory? Isn't feminism the work of women? You know, what's it got to do with us? Okay, I'm not saying that we should all be macho or sexist. I'm just saying it might not be our thing. And is there that feeling that you're trying to appropriate, to use another word from this conference, women's lives and women's politics? He's a feminist playwright, but as I say, that's an uneasy kind of identity. He's also somebody who often writes not only female dialogue, but female monologues. And of course, he's conscious that there's a whole line of male writers who have done that, starting obviously with James Joyce in Ulysses, the final monologue by Molly Bloom, a man writing through the voice of a woman. So I think there's a lot that you can unpack in all of these kind of ideas that his work suggests. There is
also a cooking early sort of cooking and creative writing class
Yeah.
in Bergerac.
Yeah.
Given
Yeah,
by,
that's
yes,
the things he added. Yeah.
maybe you'd like to comment on that.
Well, simply that in the original, there's a pastry shop run by a very famous pastry chef from the 17th century. Yeah, we're talking about France and Paris. Yeah, he's changed that into, and that's a male pastry chef, and he's changed that into a female pastry chef who also runs a writing class. So he can make lots of jokes about writing and originality in his own adapted work, which is kind of fun. It's good fun. Also, there's a speech by this particular character. She's called Layla in the play. And it's basically a reworking of Emily Dickinson. One of her lines, I've forgotten what it is exactly, because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. But Martin Crimp's version elaborates it in a slightly different way. So once again, this is all about knowledge, really. If you know the original or have some sort of knowledge of the wider situation, you probably enjoy this kind of work much more than, I mean, it's perfectly enjoyable as it is, but you get that extra kind of, I don't know, moment of recognition, if you like.
Okay, there are many questions, so I will continue with Mine Hoca. From just
hello, hi everyone. Hi Professor Sierz. This was a very stimulating talk, and I'm probably inspired by your PowerPoint images. I'm very curious about the representation of clothes in Pamela, in the adaptation of Pamela.
Okay, yeah.
The book is very much involved in, you know, her interest in these expansive stockings and all that. So how is it represented? I'm curious about that.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Thank you very much. There's a sort of problem here because I would love to say to you that that Pamela play was as successful an adaptation on the stage as the Cyrano one. The Cyrano was just fantastic. It just like blew everybody away. It's one of those moments where you leave the theatre and you think, well, that's it. I don't have to go ever again because I've seen the ultimate brilliant experience. The Pamela play was very different in that it didn't really work. This is partly not the play text, which does mention a bit about clothes, but not much. But the problem with the staging was that the director, Katie Mitchell, I think overdid the kind of sadomasochistic, the cross-dressing, the fetishism bits. At the end of the play, the woman has this strap-on dildo, you know, a penis, you know, and that wasn't in Martin Crimp's play, you know, in the written play. And I think it's a bit too obvious, you know, as a sort of image. And I think the idea of schoolgirl, of young women, even if they are there as examples of the man's, let's call it roving eye, his desire for young women, to dress them as schoolgirls suggests a kind of rather banal, I think, sexual imagery in our society. And so you could argue that although this adaptation is great because it's very radical, you could also argue that at least the first staging of it was less successful than a play like Cyrano. Okay?
Yeah, thank you so much.
Okay.
Yeah, so apparently erase the, you know, layer of narrative which is about, you know, upward social mobility through clothes.
Yeah.
But it's completely erased.
Yeah. So I don't have much more to say about that, and I'm conscious that a lot of people are waiting patiently.
So continue with Candan. You have to unmute yourself. Yeah.
Yeah. You can hear me all right?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Firstly, can I call you Alex most respectfully, because I mean I'm honored to hear you today. I mean, we've been reading you for all those years, but hearing and listening is something else. Thank you for that. But my question is a bit a general one, perhaps, and includes some bits you have also included in your talk. But my question is, how does Crimp's bringing the apparent opposites, we can also call them binaries, perhaps you also mentioned, affect his style of adaptation? Because you also referred to certain bits like in Cyrano, the adaptation being both different and close to the original texts, and also in the Pamela play, the interchangeability of men and women, like they are apparent opposites in our not contemporary but normal view. People think of them opposites. So how do you think Crimp's bringing all these opposites down and inside out affect the style of adaptation?
Yeah. Good
Thank
question.
you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Very clear and good question. I think what we're dealing with is the fact that Martin Crimp is, in my eyes anyway, a very modernist playwright, okay? Not so much a postmodernist, but more of a modernist. He has that kind of austerity about him. And it's evident if you read some of his texts, there's a certain sort of sparseness about them and a power about them that I associate with the kind of high modernism of, I don't know, 100 years ago. So I think that he's essentially interested in ambiguity, okay? And that most of the examples that we're talking about with his work is about ambiguity, okay? He's really saying this man is playing this power game, but is he? Is he really? This woman is submitting to the man, but is she? Are they? You know, those kind of questions where the meaning is very fluid and very hard to pin down. And as I said, I've interviewed him several times, and occasionally I say, well, what does this play mean, Martin? Martin, what is this? And he always says to me, well, that's not my problem, you know? And he says it's up to the audience, and he's perfectly happy if you have different views about it. Obviously, if you're reviewing it and you give him 1 star instead of 5, he's not happy. But in a sense, he doesn't care, you know. But he's providing this material, and he's saying, well, it's really up to you to determine what your meaning is for this play, okay? And his main project is that there is no simple answer, okay? He knows that in our, and also it's a very critical attitude. So he knows that in our society, men are frequently seen as predatory and women are seen as victims, okay? He knows that. But he's saying, well, I know plenty of men, or even my female friends know plenty of men who aren't predatory particularly, you know? He knows plenty of women who aren't victims. So how do you negotiate this difference between the images that we produce on stage or in film or in the television of female victims and male predators with the reality? And he's constantly trying to subvert those things, even when it's quite dangerous. There's a line in the Pamela play that's repeated twice, which is, the woman says, I'd rather be raped than bored. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, I mean, it's a deliberately provocative line. I mean, and he knows it. He's not stupid, you know. But she follows that by having, he follows it by having the man say, no woman would ever say that. And of course the woman says, I've just said it. And then the man objects again. The woman says, I decide what I say. Okay. Now, what she means is that her voice is important and her point of view is important. And actually, if she says something she doesn't mean literally, it's a perfectly valid point. So I hope that that long roundabout has sort of answered your question. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you.
And
It explains a lot.
Yeah. And also, I think, Pamela doesn't leave. He gives, says, you can, I'll give you a phone and you can, call someone, you can, and she doesn't. It's that kind of relationship, they kind of feed on this, both of them. So it's a different kind of dynamic in terms of a relationship. I remember when I first read the title of that play, I said, oh, it sounds like any kind of long-term marriage when we have sufficiently tortured each other. So, okay.
Well, Sıla, thank you for that. As somebody who's been married for 40 years, I completely see where you're coming from.
Yes. Okay. Gülten Cylinder. We have a lot of students from Ankara University, actually.
Good. Why not?
Yes. Gülten Cylinder.
Hello, Professor.
Hi.
It's a great opportunity to listen to you in the conference. And I also thank you and the organizing committee. And my question is actually about the pathetic tragedies, the she tragedies, Thomas Otway's Betrayed to Shame, the Venice Preserved.
Yeah.
You all remember. We have read most of the she tragedies in restoration class. I think most of the plays are adapted from Shakespeare's plays, and I find it's very awkward that what about the copyrights at the time of the period? What do you think of the copyrights? Could you please enlighten us about this?
Well, if you're talking of the 17th century, there was no copyright. Okay, 16th century. So people just stole and adapted. It's frequently something that amazes the American students that I teach. I don't teach a lot of Shakespeare, so I'm not particularly qualified to talk about the various adaptations and so on. But I do know that Shakespeare himself wasn't particularly involved in publishing his own play text. Somebody like Martin Crimp is fanatically involved in his own writing and his own sense of being a published writer. He needs his name to be big. He's very upset by the opera world, which always refers to the words as a libretto, which means small book. He's saying, my book isn't small, it's vital to the opera, okay? So it's text for opera or opera text. So he's very sort of passionate about the actual text and his own authority as the writer in one sense. In the 16th and 17th century, everything was much more fluid. So Shakespeare didn't care very much about his own plays being published. I think he cared about the poetry, Venus and Adonis and so on and so forth. He really cared very much that that was done well. But he was a theatre maker. And I have to say that one thing you have to know about early stagings is that if we could go back in time, we would think that they were rubbish, you know? The actors didn't have a long time to rehearse. They didn't explore their backstories. They learnt a few speeches, improvised even more. And this is obvious. I mean, it's only when the first folio is published that you get a huge amount of sort of, if you like, authorized text. But that's a real problem because Hamlet, if you spoke every word, in the text would last 5 hours. The Elizabethans spent 2 hours in the theatre and then they were off to the pub. You know, it wasn't sort of something that would have worked on stage. So what was staged was very much shorter. It was very much rougher. There was a lot of improvisation. And from that point of view, they weren't particularly worried about copyright. They were worried about putting on fresh stuff night after night or afternoon after afternoon, and getting the pennies of the audience and making money as a theatre production company. And that's what...
Yes, thank you. Because we all recognize that they are all beyond adaptations. They are nearly completely similar to the Shakespeare's original text.
No, I completely agree. Yeah. Thank you very much for raising that. That's
Continuing with Naime.
Thank you very much, Sıla Hocam. Okay.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for your great talk. I have my question is a bit long, so I took notes.
Okay.
And it is about adaptations in general sense. So I assume while deciding how to adapt a work of literature into a new kind of work, producers and writers take many things into consideration, especially if we're talking about an adaptation of work on theater stage, because physical conditions of stages can be restrictive sometimes.
Yeah.
However, I think the biggest influence on adaptations is that of our new understanding of time and what is too long and too short. What I mean is, whenever I go and see a play that I have already read, I see that it is rarely staged in the same way that it had been written, and it is always a lot shorter. And now, as a member of Gen Z, I understand that people no longer have time to sit down and watch anything for 3 or 4 hours, because there's always traffic jam and you have to drive there. There are things to do, etc. And I also really don't want to become unpopular here among you, because we have been praising adaptations since yesterday. But works of literature, I think, are altered and shortened sometimes to a point where it is difficult to figure out of which original work's adaptation it is now. And I think there are bad adaptations too. And so my question is, do you think such recreations and adaptations of certain works take away any value from them because they have been changed a lot? Because I think if people don't have time to sit for 3 hours in theater, they will not have time to go and read the original works as well. So do you think we can get to a point where everything is an adaptation and recreation of something else, and all the stories, plays, novels are now too simplified and conceived incorrectly?
Okay, wow, good question as well. Another enormous question, I have to say. I think you're right in the sense that, and I've done this myself, I've gone to see a theatre play version of a famous novel or text, simply because I couldn't spend the time or invest the time, if you like, in reading the original. So I saw a stage version of A Little Life, I think it's called, which I absolutely hated, and I had no, and although it's a really famous novel and lots of people love it, I just thought it was dreadful. And that was 4 hours. That was really, you know, I thought, well, I've crucified myself, I've given. You know, the idea that I've given, and I need never give anything more to the theatre again. So it is an interesting question about the reason why people go to see theatre shows, and also, as you pointed out, the reason why producers like to sometimes cut down theatre texts. Often the published theatre texts that we have in this country, of which, as you can see behind me, there are thousands, are different to the one performed on stage. And obviously, this is because playwrights, when they are in rehearsal, sometimes change their minds. Sometimes the actors have a really good idea that they want to use. Sometimes they want to cut the scene a bit. I think in general, the shorter, the better, as long as you convey what is important in your storytelling. Okay, so I'm perfectly happy with short plays, but I know what you mean. Sometimes you think, oh, these characters are quite interesting. They deserve longer than 90 minutes. Yeah.
Yes.
You know, so at other times I think this show is 2 hours with a 20-minute interval. Why didn't they just make it 100 minutes straight through? And then we go in, we go out, go home, and we feel happy. You know, so there's all these different feelings you can have. And so that's why it's a very big question.
Actually,
thank you
I
so
remember there
much.
was an American critic, I can't remember his name, but in a talk he said that. He said, you know, back in the, you know, good old days, for example, in Germany, if a play wasn't 3 hours long, the audience would demand their money back. And now it's just, you know, 50 minutes because people, you know, live far away and they don't have that much time to go and see a play. Okay, Hava.
Hello.
Hi.
Firstly, I would like to
Translates as Eve.
yes.
Yes, I'm just.
Firstly, I would like to thank you for such a wonderful presentation. I think my dear professor guessing what I'm going to ask about. While you are talking about the bullet points of adaptation, I was checking the boxes about Sarah Kane's adaptation, Phaedra's Love.
Yeah.
And I think your bullet points quite stimulating about this play, because when you say adaptation works the best when they are radical, and I don't think that there is much more radical person than Sarah Kane. So I thank you for that. I'm sorry for disrespect if I am disrespecting, I am diverging the discourse, but I would like to ask about In Your Face theater. I am a huge fan of In Your Face theater, and as well as your works, ever since my dear professor Sıla Şenlen introduced me to it.
Okay,
So
to the question, Hava.
Yes, I just want to ask that there are some claims that In Your Face theater is not that relatable or efficient in our times, in contemporary times. And there are such claims. What are your thoughts about this? Do you think that we now outdated In Your Face theater? But
yeah, that's a very good point. Also, I am a bit conscious that the time is passing, and I'm thankful for the question, but it's a slightly different subject, and I think it depends on different countries a lot. I think in the United States, for example, they are still discovering the work of 1990s British playwrights and often responding to the shock of some of the directness of their sensibility. In the UK, in Britain, for example, I think it's at least 10 years, at least a decade since a Sarah Kane play has been staged at a major venue. Students perhaps still stage some of her work. 448 Psychosis is brilliant for students because you can have 30 different actors speaking different parts of that particular text. Is it outdated? I'm not quite sure about that. It is definitely, to me, In Your Faceness is a 1990s sensibility, but in the hands of several playwrights, it extended into the 2000s, and even a bit more recently. I think that Martin Madonna, for example, still writes in that kind of provocative way, whether you like it or not, you know. For example, I don't like all of his plays, and especially his more recent work. So I think the only way you can really grasp this is by producing new sort of productions of the work. So Martin Madonna's The Pillow Man, which when I saw its original production, I don't know what it was, 2005, 2006, something like that, 2004, at the National Theatre, I thought, wow, this is brilliant. And then I saw it recently, earlier this year, I think, in the West End, actually, there was a good gesture. One of the main characters was changed from a man to a woman actor. So there was that kind of gender thing about it. But actually, in this production, it felt a bit glib. You know what I mean? It felt that some of the lines were a bit too easy, and that it was, you know, there was nothing really at stake. And of course, that might just be bad acting. So it's a question that's worth asking. But as I say, I think it really does depend on the cultural context of particular locations. But I hope you carry on asking that question.
Thank you so much.
Yes, continue with Harit Turki.
Thank you so much.
Ask the question, it'd be really fantastic.
Okay, I'm going to ask the question. It's a tremendous opportunity actually to be on the same platform with such an outstanding figure like Aleks Sierz, that we spent our lives actually teaching, citing, and referring to. I don't know if time allows me. I have one question regarding the presentation that he made. Professor Sierz, most of the works written either sort of adaptations or parodies of the Pamela story, where we're particularly paying attention to the play, actually, the significance of virtue in, and the way virtue is presented in Pamela, because most of them actually parodied. Do you think that Crimp did the same thing, that he actually parodied, accentuated virtue, or he took a different direction?
Yeah, that's
And I have another question regarding the in-your-face theater. Since you, it's actually a golden opportunity to be here, especially in this regard. You know, in-your-face theater actually went to the utmost, let's say, extreme by presenting violence in such a way that you remember that most of the postmodern authors tried to present violence on the stage, and actually they broke with the traditional, you know, Horatian technique of etiquette and decorum by not showing violence on the stage. But some of them tried to break with the fourth wall tradition. Some of them tried to present something different. But violence in your face theater took completely a different shape. Was it really necessary to go to this extreme to, as you put it, to grab the audience from the collars and force them to actually to consider the morals and the principles?
That's really good. They're very good, both the questions. So thank you very much for them. And in fact, I'd just like, as a generalization, to thank all of you who've asked questions, because they've all been really good and they've stimulated me, certainly. I hope my answers do as well. As regards virtue, I'm going to be very simple. As far as I know, Martin Crimp is not particularly concerned with the question of virtue. Okay, he's probably concerned with the question of being true to yourself, behaving in a truthful and emotionally grounded way. But I don't think that the idea of virtue in the kind of very classical English tradition is part of his mindset. But I would encourage you to ask him, you know, you know, that's definitely a question that would be provocative to him. As regards violence in your face theatre, I think, once again, this is something that is very much part of British culture, if I can say that. I'm not saying there's no violence in your culture or in any other culture. I'm simply saying that in British culture, one of the values, if you like, if not virtues, is a sense of authenticity. We really value authenticity. So in the 1990s, we valued pop groups like Oasis and Blur because we thought they were authentic. Yeah, Spice Girls were like plastic. Yeah, Take That is like plastic. But Oasis, yeah, they're the real thing. Okay. And with a lot of those new young writers in the 1990s, I think there was a sense in which they wanted to show that they really mean it, okay? We're not just talking about violence, we're going to show it. And why? Because we really mean it. You know, we're not just messing around. And I think the reason for some of those depictions of extreme violence is that they wanted to show that, if you like, literally, or if you like, very passionately, very intensely, very intensively. Does it always work on stage? I'm afraid it doesn't. You know, with my students, I always have to tell them when we're looking at a play like Sarah Kane's Blasted, you know, it's a play that's more shocking when you read it than when you see it, okay? When you read it and there's a stage direction about somebody sucking somebody else's eyes out, you see it in your mind. Yeah, you invent the horror yourself, okay? It's all inside your head. It's like the invisible PowerPoint. And that can be very distressing for people with a vivid imagination, or for anybody. When you see it on stage, it's completely different. You're thinking, how did they do that? Yeah. Oh, look, I can see them putting a pouch on the eye. You know, they've got little pouches with blood in them, and you can see them clumsily putting this pouch on the other actor's eye. You know, so it's the same in King Lear. You know, the blinding scene, of that. So there's this idea that sort of depicting the violence can actually be risible, funny, inadvertently. I remember seeing somebody mention Phaedra's Love. I remember seeing one production with the last scene. There's a plastic or rubber penis being thrown across the stage and all this blood and everything. And you just can't help laughing. You just think, nah, this is just something, honestly. Yeah, it's, as I say, it's one thing to read about it. It's another to see these bits and things. But it's, I suppose the real violence is the emotional violence, though. Yeah. And that's something that is less literal, if you like. So with a play like Blasted, somebody recently said to me, and I hadn't thought about this, that Ian and the way he behaves towards Kate in the first scene, he's basically been grooming her. And I thought, yes, you know, and then that makes it emotionally much deeper and more worrying and more unsettling. Oh yeah, you know, this guy's been grooming her for years. And, you know, what can we do? You know, so those kind of, it's the emotional violence, I think, that's the thing that's most troubling. And if you like, necessary. Yeah, I think it's necessary.
Yeah. We only have 3 minutes for the next session. So I have to wrap things up. I actually had a question for you concerning your mini scenarios at the end of Martin Crimp's, you know,
oh, yes.
Yes, you know, whether, you know, whether it was a parody, kind of adaptation or appropriation, but we were out of time, so.
That's good, because I'm not sure I could answer that question. It's just
yes. Okay, so our time is almost up. So on behalf of Theatre Drama Network and the audience, I would like to thank Aleks Sierz for joining us and for this delightful talk. So that's a wrap. The next session will begin in 2 minutes. Okay.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you, all of you. Thank you. Great.
Thank you so much, Aleks. Thank you.
My pleasure. It's really good. Thank you so much. And thanks for the questions. They were really excellent. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Şenlen Güvenç and Dr. Sierz. Our session is gonna be on the rooms. I mean, the room 1, room 2, please, I'm kindly inviting you to the rooms. We have 2, and if you need any help, I can help you for defining rooms. Thank you so much.
I feel like I'm in a Pamela book, inviting me to the rooms.
Yeah.
It gives you that feeling, doesn't it? The rooms. Okay.
Well, that's the way, hocam.
Yes, I know. Okay.